obviously all of you here are far more expert than I am on this one, is to ask the question. That was not the case before the Foreign Trade Development and Regulation Act was passed. In India also, it was actually the Import-Export Act, that's right, I think that was right. Trading was not a privilege, it was a controlled thing. It was a privilege that was, trading was not free, it was a privilege, not a right, it was a privilege that was granted by the state. It led to other kinds of problems, it led to a great deal of corruption and so on and so forth, but we don't go into that. So now I'm asking the question, would it be constitutional in India to have a Part 2 in the FTDR Act, which says, for example, you're the experts, not me, which says, for example, that in respect of subordinate legislation which is passed under Part 2, which is yet to be passed, of the FTDR Act, the privileges, the rights are reversed. In other words, it is not a right of the individual or the state to export, or the company to export. It is a privilege which is granted by the state, provided subject to the fact that these subjects and these commodities, which are separately notified under Part 2, are for national security reasons. Now, can this be done? I haven't the faintest idea. The reason for this is also very important. You can then say, for example, under the WMD Act, because then you have a real problem, for what are known as catch-all controls, you can say that everything is controlled if it has a particularly deleterious use, or has the possibility of a deleterious use, in which case you will have to come and say, I am telling you that I am exporting this only for this purpose, in which case I can then impose a condition. I'll say, fine, as long as your fertilizer is going to that farmer, in that farm, in that particular country, and you can then ensure that somewhere in between it didn't disappear, or it wasn't leaked out, or only half the amount reached the other end and the other half went somewhere else. If you can assure me that, then sure, you can go ahead and export. It's very difficult to do this now because of this reversal of burden of privilege, if you like, which has happened recently since 1992. It may be necessary to re-reverse this in certain cases. It will become an issue of some contention, I would imagine, both politically and juridically, but it is something that's worth thinking about. The other point is the various other kinds of juridical issues will arise. Okay, at the confluence of trade, technology, and security. For example, what is an appropriate sentence? Market value is obviously not the appropriate sentence. I mean, the part can be as small as this. If it is really crucial for the creation of a weapon of mass destruction, this can be worth about maybe 1 lakh or 2 lakhs of rupees, but you can very well imagine what kind of destruction it can have. So therefore, when he's exporting this, can I introduce disproportionate, a deliberately disproportionate punishment because of the kind of effects that he may cause, rather than anything to do with the value of the good itself. Then the question about a single unauthorized export of uranium can cause and so on, you know that. And then in cases of evidence, cases of activities which was proscribed by the WMD Act, and the most evidence is likely to have been garnered by intelligence means. Now, am I going to be forced to give this as evidence in a court where you think I can't be, because that will reveal my sources? So these issues about the admissibility of evidence, which will lead to a conviction, will become a major issue if and when a case under the WMD Act or even under the FTDR Act dealing with these kind of goods comes into question. And it will become very, very difficult when you're dealing with intangibles, which is, for example, the knowledge in the head of an engineer who went to a location in Iraq or Iran or wherever, one of these places, or worse still, if he goes to Pakistan. Then can you make the assumption that it was illegitimate unless proved otherwise? All sorts of issues of legality, of constitutional propriety, of human rights, God knows what else, will come into this area when you try to implement it. And for those of you who are gluttons for self-punishment, please read the WMD Act and you will know how complex the situation can become when that Act gets implemented. It's been 5 years since it's been passed, and implementation is nowhere near what it ought to have been by now, and certainly the legal authorities were. Finally, I think at the National Law School of India University you might want to think about introducing courses, because I can imagine in the next 10 years or so cases of this kind will become very, very prominent, and cases of a different kind. But nevertheless, at the confluence of national security, technology and law will become routine, not only this law but also space law, and the new Atomic Energy Act, which is going to be passed, matters connected with compensations to be issued in the event of a particular types of accident involving nuclear commodities, which may not be a weapon at all. So lots of work still, and my consultancy fees are quite modest. Thank you very much.
May I ask one question? Is India a signatory to the resolution 1540? If yes, what benefits India is going to derive?
India is neither a signatory nor a non-signatory. It is compulsory on everybody, all members. Because you're a member of the United Nations and it's a Chapter 7 resolution, it is mandatory in all the countries who are members of the United Nations.
Sir, if I say that the 1540 is the parent of international terrorism, am I correct?
Yeah. No.
Yes. Trade in dangerous weapon has been made free. Trade in, you say,
the whole resolution is about controlling it.
Controlling.
Prohibit.
So you actually think the UN will pass a resolution to free up trade in weapons of mass destruction?
Controlling.
No, that's exactly the opposite. One of the examples of Siddhartha's modesty is that he has had a fairly involved role in even the writing of the WMD Act. Most of us, by the way, are taking liberties in running across topics and so on because we are involved in several of them. I am committed to introduce myself other than my own name, but I'll take 10 seconds to mention to you that on the issues of export control and technology safeguards, I work with an institution that now works in about 70 plus countries. We work very heavily with the different departments of the Indian government and with the corporate sector here. We also work with the UN Security Council and the IAEA, as well as with the US government and multiple other multinational groupings. These being friends and colleagues for years and years, we take liberty with how we talk about these subjects. But let me use that as a segue to introduce our next speaker, because it brings in, on top of what Dr. Siddhartha has mentioned in terms of the legal lens through which you're looking at this problem, also the threat description in India itself. How do you look at India and its national security template? What are the challenges we face? Professor Rajesh Rajagopalan is currently a professor and the chair of the Center for International Politics, Organization and Disarmament, which is part of the School of International Studies at JNU. He has a very distinguished background, has also worked for a few years at the Observer Research Foundation, but also with the Indian National Security Council Secretariat. Eminently qualified to speak on framing the threat. So with that, let me turn to Rajesh. Yeah, and then let's open up for the...
Yeah. Thank you. I'll try and keep this very brief. This is Dr. Siddharth said that he is intimidated by the fact that he's talking to lawyers. I should be even more so because he's at least spent time looking at, not just looking at, but actually framing the WMD Act and as well as on the 1540 committee and so on. I mean, I'm a complete outsider in this group because I'm a social scientist, but I know what this is done again a lot of work on legal issues, whereas I have not. So what I plan to do, especially given that we don't have very much time, I'll very briefly talk about, since we're talking largely about nuclear issues, I'll talk about the logic of India's nuclear policy, some of the dilemmas that we face, and some of the major issues that are coming up in the next few years, but from a rather broader perspective than the specifics that Dr. Siddharth talked about. When you look at one of the surprising things about Indian nuclear policy, obviously, is the fact that we took so much time to decide that we wanted to build nuclear weapons. In the 1960s, we had the capability to do it, and there are implications, legal implications of why of that delay, because the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that Dr. Siddharth mentioned was framed in the late 1960s. In 1968, so if we had actually tested the weapon in sometime in the mid-60s, before 1968, as opposed to testing it in 1974, then we would have a nuclear weapon state, and we wouldn't have to have the US-India nuclear deal and worry about the CTBT and all of these other things that came, was primarily because we didn't test when we could have potentially. I'm sure we had made an effort then in the mid-60s. So there are, in a sense, some of these policy issues ended up having quite serious legal consequences, international legal consequences for our policy. So why this delay? Why this why this rather relaxed attitude towards nuclear weapons and security issues? I think one of the reasons is that India is a fairly secure state. I think we are a very large country, very powerful country, and we live in the middle of rather very small countries, quite small countries, quite weak countries, including Pakistan. I mean, if you actually look at Pakistan, the amount of material, amount of wealth, the proportion of national wealth that is spent on their security, and if you look at the proportion of national wealth that we spend on our security, we spend only about half of what they spend in proportionate terms. But our overall, even spending half of it proportionately, the amount that we spend is roughly about 6 to 8% higher than 6 to 8 times higher than what Pakistan spends. So, and that rough figure has been continuous throughout the last 40-50 years since independence. So what, in a sense, that tells you something about, even though Pakistan is the strongest of our neighbors, if you exclude China of course, but within the region, they are no match for us in a sense. So given that very secure sort of environment, we tend to be very relaxed about threats. We tend to take our own time and so on and so forth. China is a very different case. Obviously China is much stronger, wealthier, but we have somehow never seen China as a major problem maybe because of the Himalayas, maybe because historically we have not felt a threat from China, but for a variety of reasons we have again, so in a sense we have not compared ourselves to China in that sense. So we have, that again adds to our sense of security, adds to our sense of some level of invulnerability that makes us much more relaxed in our approach to security issues. Internal security also, even though we talk about Maoists as a major problem and whatnot, and we've had rebellions in Punjab and the Northeast and Kashmir, of course, but none of them have been threats to the country as a whole. I mean, they've been minor. If at all any of them could have succeeded, it would have been secession as a part of the country. But none of them ever threatened the country as a whole. Unlike, let's say, the Chinese rebellion or what happened to the Soviet Union or potentially what happened to Pakistan. It was much lower levels of threat, even though we think of it as very serious, but nevertheless they are lower. So the point about all of that is that both externally and internally we have been a fairly secure state, and that doesn't mean that we don't have to, even individually as citizens, we don't worry about every time we go to a market and about terrorism and whatnot. But terrorism is like crime at some level. I mean, it is crime, obviously, but it is even as security threat, it is much lower level in the sense that we worry about the individual level. We worry about things like Mumbai and the attack on our embassy in Kabul and whatnot. But those things don't destroy. I mean, they don't threaten us. They don't threaten the survival of our society, of our state. And so, in a sense, we are angry about those things, but it doesn't really make a way into existential. They are not existential. I mean, to use the right word, they are not existential in the way that Pakistan, for example, thinks of us as an existential threat. They assume that we will someday undo the partition, that we will gobble them up. We already gobbled up half their country, at least divided them. So that kind of existential threat we don't feel. I mean, we don't worry about that. So there, in a sense, that makes us somewhat more relaxed. And so every time people say, why are we such a weak state? Why don't we kick back? Part of the reason I think is because of the fact that most of this stuff, Parakram happened, Kargil happened, and Mumbai happened, and it has had no impact on, let's say, our economic growth. I mean, we are chugging along at 8%, 6%, 7%, 8%, and these things have had no impact. So in a sense that illustrates again the resilience. But the downside of the resilience is, of course, that we tend to be much more, like I said, much more relaxed. So in a sense, nuclear, it impacts also on our nuclear policy and broad approach to nuclear weapons. So we broadly think of nuclear weapons. We don't think of nuclear weapons the same way, for example, the Russians and the Americans did, which is have 30,000 nuclear warheads constantly ready to be fired at any point of time. We tend to think of nuclear weapons as a necessary evil. It's something that we have to have because Pakistan has it, China has it, lots of others have it. So we need to have the only thing that can deter others from using nuclear weapons against us or threatening to use nuclear weapons against us is us having our own nuclear weapons. But outside of that,